Thanks. Thanks everyone for joining us today. And thanks, Megan, um, for providing this exciting platform for me to share my work today. And I'm looking forward to the conversation of my presentation. I'm going to share my screen to make sure we get it. Oops. Okay, here it is. Uh, Megan, you can see it, right? Full screen? Perfect. Okay. So to just frame this, this is one part. I'm also going to set my time, sorry. Um, this is one part of a three-part manuscript, where the other two substantive parts are deal with, one of them deals with the efflorescence of street food into gastronomic discourse, which I argue is linked to processes of depeasantization and the death of the peasantry. That's about a third of the manuscript. And another section, theoretical section on the limits of disciplinary knowledge, where in fact I'm working on various authors, some of whom are in the audience today. So today's talk is called Aftertaste of Empire, Cultural Imperialism and Asian Nationalisms. I will start with um, these kind of epigrammatic quotations from Oscar Wilde. In fact, the whole of Japan is a pure invention. There is no such country, there are no such people. The Japanese people are, as I have said, simply a mode of style, an exquisite fancy of art. And in another way, you can see this section of my work, today's presentation, is a long response to something Madhur Jaffrey kind of quipped to me, which is, why do Americans love the food of the people they have gone to war with? In both these things, there's a kind of gesture towards recovering the geopolitical dimensions of good taste over the last 50 years, in my case. So, a connection is posited here between taste and geopolitics that is rarely interrogated in gastronomy. Given the chasm between the quotidian and the grand, that might seem inevitable. Yet I think that gap grows more glaring with the current international tumult. The second Trump administration has ruptured the post-war international institutional structure of governance under U.S. hegemony, revealing the seams of the system that was taken for granted. So I think that gives me an opportunity to interject in this particular context. As most of you would be familiar with, there's a rich and varied literature on how the food system, specifically production and distribution, is shaped by capitalism and the Cold War. Yet discussions of good taste in gastronomy are unaccounted for with much geopolitical insight. Is it because the form of food has no relationship with the interstate system, unlike, say, literature or movies or music? I think merely posing the question reveals the limits of that presumption. Much of the literature on soft power and gastrodiplomacy, I think, is relatively poorly theorized. So this is an attempt to get past those constructions and postulate a reason why and how Americans came to love the food of the people they have gone to war with. So let me begin in the gut of the American empire, so to say. Helen Rosner, the formidable restaurant critic of The New Yorker, writes that Café Mars, a nouveau Italianate American restaurant, serves a pancake primavera, which she describes as a big, trembling okonomiyaki of Italian greens and pickled root vegetables. Similarly, Jason Stewart, a restaurant critic from Los Angeles, gestures towards a number of Japanese references in his visit to Noma in September 2023. He talks about there was this young green rice from Japan with green tofu made mostly from soy, followed by crudités of the day's best leaves, berries, vegetables, and other bits, all sliced uniformly thin by hand with a special knife from Japan. The meal closed with an ice cream sandwich mimicking onigiri, the handheld Japanese rice ball swaddled in a seaweed sheet. So the triangular molded ice cream is flavored with Danish bitters and wrapped in a white sheet. Such references to Japanese ingredients, terminology, techniques, and style are routine cliches today in the writing on food in global cities such as New York, London, Berlin, and Frankfurt that I have studied most closely. They, in fact, have become de rigueur in high-end restaurant reviews. It's one of the few cuisines allowed into the space of gourmetization, in Jean-Pierre Paulin's words, which is the elevation of some cuisine into global gastronomic discourse. Rossner, who has been critical of lists such as the world's 50 best, which are unrealistic even when done with integrity, which is rarely the case, writes that Jose Andres's new chain restaurant, The Bazaar, is more or less turn of the millennium culinary modernism grafted onto some second thing, which is Japan. The conceit that holds this compilation together is the 17th century journey of Hasekura Tsunenaga, a Japanese samurai of imperial descent. Uh, 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 Folks love such, in fact, gamifying reference to the court of Spain and the presumed culinary chimeras that emerged from that meeting. These kinds of incoherent hegemonic multiculturalism continue to be emphasized in isomorphisms um, between Spanish and Japanese kitchens, the plancha and the tepan, the robata and the josper, which is a coal-fired fired grill, and a flat cooking surface. One might point out that, in fact, coal-fired grilled meats and flat cookware can be found almost anywhere in the world. Turkey, India, Iran, Ghana. But it appears with kind of cultural capital only when associated with Japanese things. Even an indulgent tribute to the Trogoff family of French chefs, Frederick Weissman's film, spends the last part parsing Japanese aesthetics and family credentials in being there 25 years earlier. These convergences in taste are both material and in the eye of the beholder, as a referent in a hegemonic global discourse of haute cuisine style. And these trends are filtering down into the marketplace, as shown by the National Restaurant Association database, etc. Hanya Yanagihara, an American novelist, editor, and travel writer, provides a coda in the style section of the Tea magazine of the New York Times. I quote, "It wasn't just that I finally understood how much of my aesthetic life has been wrought by Japan. It was that I understood that I was somewhere that had determined much of the modern world's aesthetic preoccupations. It felt stubbornly sui generis, a place that has remained distinctly apart despite all its trappings of modernity and globalization. A place whose visual and artistic sensibility, though much of it originated in China and Korea, felt irreducible and inimitable." She goes on to underline the importance not only of Japan-associated food, including matcha, but also pop music, fandom, otaku, fashion, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today, and architecture. Even attitudes such as the joy of tidiness, of course, Marie Kondo, even the power of cuteness. Yanagihara gestures towards what I'm seeking to do here, but stops short when she writes, "Celebrating a culture is different from venerating a country. Although this issue isn't about Japan's geopolitical past or present, Reading the articles in it is to be confronted with Japan's modern history, the brutality it inflicted upon others, and the brutality inflicted upon it. Ligai Mishan, the most recent restaurant critic of the New York Times, takes it further in the same issue in a discussion on the politics of cuteness. She relates that after Murakami to she connects that to Japan's humbling defeat of imperial ambitions, post-war occupation, and the Vietnam War, leading to a politics of what he calls self-medicated denizens of a castrated nation state, pampered children enthralled by by our own cuteness, end quote. Cute is the opiate of the people, Ligai Mishan concedes, but then opens it up with a question. I quote, or has this embodiment of powerlessness become itself a kind of power? End quote. She tries to bring some unruliness to this cuteness, but there's no escaping the fact, as I'll argue in the kind of rest of today's talk, that cuteness depends on the infantilizing patronage of the powerful, a product of a certain kind of imperial domination, as of course Oscar Wilde in some ways gestured towards about in the quote. Wilde was, of course, commenting on the question of mimesis in first wave Japonisme in particular, and art more generally. Of course, he was exaggerating the truth, as was his style, but tellingly, I think Western restaurant critics have not yet caught up on the acuteness of that insight. Without such a critical insight, once a cuisine climbs in a hierarchy of taste, almost all the discussion is focused on the internal aesthetic nature of a particular cuisine. Its essence, its style, its philosophy, use of certain ingredients, minimalism, beauty, subtlety, plate presentation, skill of the chef, tradition, etc., etc. The very things that were once considered liabilities for its global reach, such as we have very good example, use of olive oil, garlic, and herbs in the case of Italian cuisine in American eyes, or in this particular case, raw fish, soy, sake, and rice in the case of Japanese cuisine, are reinterpreted as assets. So in most cases, what changes is not the cuisine, but the context, much of which is geopolitical. So in this essay and in my longer work, I bracket the internal characteristics of a cuisine to pay attention to its external features, which are related to the demographic and geopolitical context. And I do that analytical operation from a particular place, in this case, New York City, one of a number of global cities where cuisines come to be consecrated in the hierarchy of taste by a combination of makers and commentators. This next section, I call it second wave Japonisme, the politics of attention and naming. The triumph of a certain kind of Japanese cuisine is related in part to the rise of post-war Japan as a major economic and cultural powerhouse. Soft power appears to follow economic power with a generation's lag, as we are seeing with South Korea today. And soft power follows hard power, exactly as it was conceived in Joseph Nye's recommendation on extending American power in the world. So things like access to the huge American market, including military provisioning for the Korean and the Vietnam Wars, and protection by the US military, were central to the Cold War rebuilding of Japan and South Korea. So there's enough evidence to show that Japanese culinary aesthetics has peaked in the 21st century in most global cities. I show New York data here. I have data on a number of global cities in the West, and I depend on others like James Farrar, David Wang on East Asian cities like Seoul and Shanghai. So here you can see Japanese cuisine joining New American, French, and Italian cuisine as a hegemonic element in most large American cities. I have analyzed details of restaurant menus with attention to median prices for appetizer, main course, dessert, or set menu among all restaurants. And if you want that data, I can share it with you. It strengthens the presumption that sushi and increasingly even yakitori restaurants in New York City fetch the highest prices, often as a set menu. But the Japanese exception, as the only non-white power invited to join the big league of haute cuisine, such as my analysis in this case of Zagat or Yelp, Michelin, and World's 50 Best, uh, it's related to a longer term, more durable connection between Western cultural elites and Japonismo that historians have highlighted. I will get to Japonismo in one more aside. If you add all the cuisines, all the examples of cuisines valorized by global tastemakers today on the world's 50 list, best list, or Michelin, which I look into each individual case. Here, I just shared the New York Times, New York City data. Uh, at best, we are talking about 15 instances of national cuisines within quotation marks in a universe of, just to remind folks, about 200, to be more specific, 193 countries listed, say, in the United Nations. That is no more than 7.5% of the universe of all nation states, marking the shape of global culinary elites at its most inclusive limits. Since most nation states have more than one regional cuisine, the denominator here would be in the thousands, reducing the percentage further. To put it another way, more than 90% of nation states cannot acquire culinary soft power because they lack the adequate hard power. So one of my arguments is that soft power can only be built on hard power, although soft power does not necessarily follow hard power in every aesthetic domain equally. And no amount of propaganda and soft power can make the world flat culturally because it remains an acutely unequal capitalist world economy. Capital and state power matter more than anything else. And this argument tries to close the loop between capital and cultural capital that has often escaped the consideration of cultural theorists and most pointed criticisms of Pierre Bourdieu's work in distinction. Now I move more directly to this kind of last wave of Japonismo and connect it. Jason Farago, the art critic in the New York Times, recently underlined the long history of what he calls the migration and metabolization of Katsushika Hokusai's vivid compositions and bourgeois themes in the West. Prints by Gauguin and Whistler absorbed Hokusai's blocky colors and flattened spaces. It shows up in Steuben glassworks and among fancy jewelers. The published score of Debussy's La Mer displayed Hokusai's wave on the cover. And Europeans, he notes, by Hokusai's long life, had been drawing on Chinese, Persian, Indian sources in the decorative arts. But, and here's a bit of a long quote, when Japanese prints finally began to circulate in Western Europe after his death, Hokusai's death, especially in 1870s Paris, defeated in war and transforming at full tilt into a metropolis, they appeared as both aesthetic gems and spiritual life rafts. Japonisme was in the process of revolutionizing the vision of the European peoples. The pottery, the lacquerware, and above all, the woodblocks brought to Europe a new sense of color, a new decorative system, and if you prefer a poetic imagination. For the artist who would become the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist, whose soft colors, flat expanses, and neglect of shading would never have emerged without their Japanese forerunners. It wasn't just the pictorial grammar, it was also Hokusai's bourgeois as in urban sensibility, his attention to theater and fashion and women of the night. That taste for city life convinced many, like Monet and Degas and their peers, and that their fleeting impressions of modern French life would be the stuff of high art, end quote. So it is not only in the aesthetic realm that the Japanese have made their mark for over a century. In the domain of alternative nutrition, for instance, Japanese macrobiotics have strongly shaped Western alternative culture, where Nyoichi Sakurazawa, renamed George Oshawa, developed an influential, if over elaborate theory of macrobiotics that claim to link good diet to genetics, living conditions, social class, location, and climate in his 12 theorems and 7 stages. So, my larger argument here is even microbiopolitics has to be placed in the geopolitical structure it belongs. And of course, most of you would be familiar with the fact that French Nouvelle Cuisine, especially as interpreted by arguably the first global chef based in Lyon, Paul Bocuse, in our era, had already appropriated the use of empty space and decentered layout on the plate and the minimalism that would lead to the mockery of tweezered food in tiny portions in some quarters. So the next section is called the view from inside out. This up till now, we have a view from outside in. From the inside out, by the Meiji period in 1871, some of the first laws provided legal protection to heritage in the form of temples and shrines. Heritage making was essential to nation building. In the more near term, Stephanie Assmann notes that promoting a Japanese culinary heritage could yield an upswing in food exports. That was the expectation. And reminds us, and I quote, that the inscription of Washoku, which is a neologism, followed shortly after the nuclear disaster at Fukushima nuclear power plant in March 2011, which made the safety of food products from Japan questionable. And one of the functions of the new culinary soft power was a tool to dismiss such so-called harmful rumors. Assmann proposes that concerns of dietary health, low food self-sufficiency, and the decline of agriculture have led the Japanese government to frame food education as the moral responsibility of individuals as a form of governmentality, end quote. So such anxieties, along with the demands of internal and international tourism, lead to initiatives of local heritage making. In a sharply reflective essay in the Journal of Asian American Studies titled A Critical Culinary Genealogy of Japanese Foodways, Corinne Mitsuye Sugino makes a number of important points. She brings a critical food studies aperture to the contemporary journalistic hagiography of Japanese food. For instance, in weighing in against state propaganda, she undermines the self-mythologizing of the Japanese state and its adoring audiences of a one unified and eternal Japanese culture. She notes that Japan is, in fact, I quote, a string of more than 7,000 islands in the Pacific, with multiple indigenous communities, including the Ainu, the Yamato, the Kumaso, the Hayato, and many others. So it is unlikely to have one homogeneous and continuous culture, so foreign to the Japanese state and its international mythologizers. Yet, through colonial expansion, she notes, the Yamato Japanese would universalize their own lineage while suppressing other languages, cultures, and communities, eventually coming to stand in the Japanese as a singular ethnic group. This next section is called Back to the Twining of the Inside and the Outside. So modern Japanese idioms have also dramatically reshaped, as many of you know, children's culture globally. Especially via manga, animation, and video games, restructuring urban taste for the foreseeable future. Some analysts have plumbed the sources of these forms to 12th century four-picture roles, heightened and refracted through American comic books under military occupation. Japanese entrepreneurs have moved from producing cheap toys for the global market during the First World War to useful machines such as cars by the 1970s to machines for what one author has called the proliferation of fantasies, such as starting with Sony Walkman, karaoke consoles, and machine kid entertainment hybrids such as Transformers and Hello Kitty. Hello Kitty, by the way, has made an estimated $80 billion for its maker. So paradoxically, Japanese pop culture figures proliferated as the economy came to a grinding halt in the 1990s with the collapse of the financial market, end of the real estate boom, and the demographic debt of an aging population. It is as if cultural capital lives in the afterglow of an one-time economic growth, as one of my professors, Emmanuel Wallerstein, had predicted. Uh, this one example, I'm going to go a little bit into it, is men's attire, where a slightly different trajectory opened up for men's fashion, my last example today. The mimicry of American preppy style lasted longer than in the domain of comic books and animation. That was linked to the structure of economic development. After the US decimated Japanese cities with war crime levels of civilian targeting, the Japanese learned, or perhaps were bullied, to mimic the attire of the GI, the jazz musician, and the upper class Ivy League student. Like anywhere else in the world, textiles and tailoring were the earliest modes of economic recovery and aesthetic aspiration, even before the proliferation of white goods in the kitchen, in transportation, and in entertainment. We, of course, have the long history of it in Brodell's three-volume history of capitalism. Japanese economic recovery was provided an incomparable boost by the US-led Korean War after 1950 that allowed Japanese companies to supply the US military, which reached over 75% of the country's export at one point. Toyota's president said that American military contracts for cargo trucks during the Korean War saved and revived his company, to the eventual chagrin of General Motors and Ford. Access to the US military supply chain and protection of the national market allowed the Japanese economy to recover, rebuilding consumer demand that came with style. The location of Korea and Japan on the other side of the Soviet Union made it urgent for the American state to rebuild Japan, as they were doing with Germany and Italy on the other side in Europe. Textiles play an important role in early phases of industrialization and reindustrialization. What was mimicked in the textile-led recovery was tight chino pants, button-down shirt, JFK style, dryer-aided 70-30 hair parting, and Ivy League style enunciated as IB. It was the Brooks Brothers repertoire that they were after, with slim tapered pants without pleats, jackets with natural shoulders, trim with 3 to 4 gold buttons, ties with plain rather than Windsor knots, polished black shoes. Japanese labels such as Uniqlo, Kamakura shirts, Evisu, and Capital came to the rescue of high-class, high-end American attire as ametero, Japanese enunciation and contraction of American traditional, often preserving what had gone out of fashion or was class and race restricted on home turf. It is not a coincidence that the Japanese were mimicking a white, upper class, straight attire exactly when hip hop was undermining their hegemony in American cities. Eventually, Japanese company with names such as Kentucky and Bathing Ape would challenge the casual wear and streetwear market, transcending them. In the next step, avant-garde fashion would take off against the grain of American traditionalism with loose architectural design, in some ways anti-sexy clothes, influencing and kind of anti-nice, anti-neat sensibility. But this is not just about symbolic production and its global circulation. As stated earlier, the US first destroyed Japan during the Second World War and then rebuilt it under its anti-communist tutelage by investing in the economy and providing access to the US home market. The Japanese economy grew in double digits in the wake of the Korean War in 1950, with nearly 3 billion in orders for the war effort, which included food, clothing, ammunition, and general purpose vehicles. Those were some of the gross openings provided to the Japanese economy under American imperium. Then there were finer opportunities. For instance, Reagan's deregulation in 1982 opened up the American market for Japanese content, such as G.I. Joe, which was animated in Tokyo in 1985, or the Transformers, which is designed by Americans, but the merchandise was produced in Japan, eventually leading to the blockbuster Mighty Morphin Power Rangers in 1993 that would consume my stepson's attention for years to come, along with all his friends. American studios began to produce Japanese-style animation films such as Avatar and Teen Titans, setting the stage for Pokemon with the pursuit of pocket monsters, priming children with fake but addictive accumulation, and of course, Super Mario. At the end of 1999, Pokemon had earned $5 billion, about the size of the rest of the US gaming industry. So some conceptual takeaways here in this next section as I reach kind of towards the closing arguments. So the center of gravity of the global economic system has shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific and the Indian Ocean world, while US hegemony is on its last legs. And I use hegemony here in the way Immanuel Wallerstein and specifically Giovanni Arrighi uses it, which is drawing on Gramsci's work, but playing it out in the global context. Cultural hegemony, so while US hegemony is in its last leg, cultural hegemony, especially culinary hegemony, lives on. It appears that hegemony casts a longer shadow in the realm of culture. Its echoes last long after the main actors have moved off stage. China's economic, military, and strategic rise today has checkmated American power, but a new hegemonic system is not yet in place, and China's cultural hegemony may be way into the future if we ever get there. But one can predict at least one of its legs of future hegemony has to be probably Sinocentric, even in a multipolar hegemonic system. Similarly, the economic and demographic rise of India is also reshaping the geopolitical world, but that trajectory is a few decades behind the Chinese wager. If we look at the biggest centers of accumulation, you have a trajectory where we have US, China, EU, East Asia, where in this case, I'm excluding China in this lumping and splitting, and India towering over others in the simple arithmetic of projected economic size, say by 2050. We will have to wait and see in which direction the hegemonic transition goes and how that shapes the transformation in the realm of culture, and how rising powers such as China and India and their minions and protagonists position themselves in relationship to what I see as Euro-American East Asian culinary hegemony under US auspices. So it's more than a qualifying comment here. It is more than a US-Japan style of exchange of style. If, for instance, in certain regions of India, such as the Northeast, Japanese culinary and comic book culture has resonances that are countercultural to Indian racism and colorism. In one instance, Anityam, a respondent from Guwahati, Assam, notes, and I quote him, "I think, first of all, perhaps the similarity some of us share with terms of Mongoloid racial features," that's his word, creates a fertile ground of attraction to their culture. Kiria from Nagaland in northeastern India adds, I quote, "In the various movies and shows, there are so many scenes where different cuisines of Japan are depicted, like ramen, tempura, beef bento box, onigiri, udon, and so on. Every dish shown looks so appetizing. The way in which the characters consume them makes me drool and crave some such dishes. And then he goes on to build links to use of soy sauce, um, bamboo shoots, etc., in Northeast Indian cuisine and East Asian cuisine. So, in some ways, there's a biopolitics of global capitalism at play here. By the 21st century, it was clear that the quip from the Japanese co-star of Michael Douglas in the movie Black Rain, where he says, "Music and movies are all your culture is good for." The Japanese tells the American, "We make the machines." That moment has been superseded by the political economic architecture. Now China makes the machines and Japan the cultural idiom in numerous domains, including the comic and the culinary. Cultural analysis of food is typically cooked with concerns of, especially in food studies, concerns of class, race, gender, and nation, even ethnicity and caste. But there's little on its structured transnational geopolitical frame, other than oft repeated and increasingly, I find, inane reference to increasing flows and globalization, often with vague and overgeneralized reference to neoliberalism and gentrification without economic or political specificity. So my work and projected work hopes to recover the geopolitical dimension of arguments about gastronomy over the last 50 years, as seen from New York City, one of the centers of the capitalist world economy, and an important site of its global governance, perhaps also on its last legs. It is only, of course, with the decline of US hegemony that one can clearly see its structure in retrospect as the owl of Minerva takes flight at dusk, etc. I show how one can read the shape of global culinary culture as twining around the geopolitical frame, growing towards the orb of power to which analysis of class, race, and gender can add to, but I don't think can fully exhaust. At best, we find soft bits of geopolitical gristle show up as globalization in discussions of taste between the teeth in the last quarter of the 20th century. That gap in gastronomy is surprising because we do have a robust literature, as I said earlier, in comparable fields of knowledge such as literary culture, movies, music, soap operas, and advertisements, textiles, and architecture. Given the current context, theories of culinary culture propose an oddly atomized nationalist quest by the 193 odd nation states in response to globalization, sometimes in the form of nativism, and other times as soft power or gastro diplomacy. I find discussions of soft power mostly inadequate, failing to account for the geopolitical order, its hierarchical structure in the name of every nation's nationalism. Most of that discussion is about how this or that nation, say Japan or Italy or Thailand, have acquired soft power while others have not, such as India or Turkey, and how they might go about acquiring it. Almost all the discussions there is about individual nations in an unstructured sea of nations, sometimes inadequately theorized as rhizomatic, in other words, lacking hierarchical geopolitical structure. I think that will be the crux of my argument. My work is closer to kind of place this work. My work is closer to that of James Farrar and David Wang's The Global Japanese Restaurant, say about the importance of the Japanese empire in the valorization of East Asian emulative tastes. For instance, in blue, you will see quite distinctive about Japanese empire in East Asia. In Korea and Taiwan, the Japanese were about 2.5% and 4% of the populations, compared to Dutch and British Indies, where the Dutch and the British themselves were at less than 0.01 and 0.03% of the population in the empire. So at some point, in some cities, 30% of East Asia, 30% of the population, in this case of Korean cities, by 1920 was Japanese. This is from Farrar and Wang. So there's in some ways a labor-intensive empire which works towards emulative pressure of other aspiring social classes that in fact work a lot less in, say, the Dutch Indonesia or even in British India. Um, one of the strongest arguments connecting geopolitics to demographic change and cultural politics of good taste that retains that sense of an unequal world is made by Mark Padungpat in the Flavors of Empire, which is about how Americans developed a taste for Thai food long before any of them had met anyone from Thailand, and in fact, long before there was a substantial Thai migration into the US. That, which is usually seen as a causal relationship. That Padungpat says was directly related to the Vietnam War and the American GI's destination of Bangkok to satisfy their two appetites, food and sex, under protection of a US geopolitical ally, which is where we get military touristic standardizations such as red, green, and masaman curry and pad thai, as if that is what every Thai eats all the time. That engagement in taste was driven by Cold War geopolitics and American imperialism. Wars, and there's a direct relationship, wars bring journalists who not only cover the war, but also file lifestyle stories to pay for their sojourn, which drives tourist interests. So, in a sense, invaders often come as tourists the second time around. So, as Madhur Jaffrey quipped to me, why do Americans love the food of the people they have gone to war with? And this is an extended argument with that quip that has happened with Thailand in the course of the Vietnam War, with Vietnam more directly, with South Korea, and most importantly for our purposes here today with Japan. One can even explain, I think, the American rediscovery of Italian food as a post-war phenomena, partially the result of US occupation, in conjunction, of course, with domestic demographic change in the US that I have talked about in The Ethnic Restaurateur. So Padungpat and Farrar and Wang are models for my own work, who are rare exceptions in identifying the taste for empire with its global proliferation. Since I have about a little over 5 minutes, let me maybe have time to delve a little deeper into the theoretical literature. So this next slide is predictably leads 15 years after the smashing success of Orientalism in reconfiguring the study of the Arab world, Edward Said set out to make a broader argument about the relationship between political economic power and aesthetic form in culture and imperialism. It was an argument about the geopolitics of the humanities, based on a close reading on novels in Western languages, especially French and English, and much less in German, for which he was criticized, within a wider aperture of culture. He showed how culture is decisively shaped by empire and historical capitalism, notwithstanding nationalist framing that assumes, for instance, that the English novel was shaped exclusively by developments within the nation state. One of the central problems, I think, in a lot of the sociological work coming out of UK. My argument here is twofold. First, if we connect culinary aesthetic form to really existing historical capitalism with its changing center of gravity, which many people miss, that 21st century capitalism is very different from 19th century or 20th century capitalism, including its center of gravity. We can reveal a persistent global hierarchy of taste that includes numerous East Asian nationalist players. I extend that empirical material backward to Japonisme and Impressionism and widen the aperture to include manga, movies, and menswear. Secondly, when addressed, such questions of culinary imperialism have attended to impositions from the center of empire on its outpost, French on the Algerians, Vietnamese, Spanish on Latin Americans, and of course the whole discussion of McDonaldization around the world. I show, in fact, how the backwash of culinary imperialism transforms international and inter-ethnic relations of taste. Within national spaces, the attention to, as I said, to class, gender, race, and ethnicity are seen as adequate, at least in the American world, with little attention to the hierarchical transnational cultural space that Said spent so much time analyzing. Migration and supply chains are often the only ways national cultural spaces are connected in those culinary narratives. That constitutes an important dimension, but that does not provide a full understanding of cultural imperium, specifically the geographical hierarchy of taste. I think most importantly, mistaken formulations of globalization as flattening rhizomatic flows across the spaces of the nation state is at the heart of that misapprehension of the world. Such a point of view is most often purveyed by theorists from the global north on the left and in the liberal center, whose own experiences of easy transnational travel with strong passports colors their perspective as standpoint philosophy asserts it must. On the other hand, nationalists from re-emergent economies, such as China and India, who fantasize about their own self-promotion in the hierarchy of nation-states, assume and promote a nation-bound system that underplays its architecture of power. So imperial and nationalist delusions play into these misreadings of the shape of global flows and frictional encounters. It's a rhetoric of imperial and national greatness that has been used before, not only by Spain and Portugal in the 16th century, but with deafeningly repetitive frequency in the modern period by the British, the French, the Belgians, the Japanese, the Russians, and of course the Americans. In most of the writing about culinary cultures, imperialism and nationalism vanish as critical analytical categories, naturalizing new hierarchies of upwardly mobile nations in the global capitalist world economy. I read the rich new literature on Japanese and Korean food in the media coverage coming out of New York City, such as in the New York Times, in the New Yorker, Michelin, Zagat, and Yelp, to make an argument where I use descriptive quantitative analysis of what can be counted, discourse analysis, to make this kind of, in some ways, a critique of concepts of such as soft power and gastro diplomacy. By culture, Said assumes practices such as, this is my last point here, assumes practices such as the arts of description, communication, and representation meant to deliver pleasure. His focus is on narrative fiction, and most of you would recall opening with Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which he characterizes both as an imperialist text about the conquest of the world and an anti-imperialist one in exposing the patched together seams of racism and nationalism that makes too much out of complexion, hair, nose, and heritage. Culture, in this sense, is a source of identity that is always xenophobic. It posits a combative posture towards the culture of others, inside and outside the nation, where the racist supremacy of imperialism is countered with the superiority of nationalist classics, as is happening in many parts of the world, including China and India, most aggressively. The latter characteristically demeans the subaltern within the nation and the nationalist other, Indians against Chinese, Dalit and Muslims, Chinese against Indians, Muslim and Tibetans, for instance. This elevated culture, where the culinary rarely figures, is divorced from the everyday world of capitalism. So culture becomes a dance of high-minded imperialisms and nationalisms. And the point of this project is to bring them down to earth, to the level of the gut. And so this analysis brings the economy and the state back in, especially in a context of an interstate system that has mostly vanished since the cultural turn. Even the post-structuralist goes a long way back, the post-structuralist turn, which is state in the interstate system vanishes. So my analysis, I hope to bring the economy and the state in this interstate system back into discussions of cultural power from where it has receded after the cultural turn. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Krishnendu.